Hey, this is Helen Dawson, and you're listening to the Innovation Crowd podcast. Businesses are looking to reinvent themselves, be more digital, more sustainable, and thrive in a volatile world. Yet most corporate innovation programs don't deliver. In fact, many don't even survive after their second birthday. On this show, I sit down with the experts to discuss the strategies that work, so you don't have to learn the hard way. So come and join me in the Innovation Crowd. Welcome back to the Innovation Crowd podcast. So each episode we talk to a different person to give us a perspective on the world of innovation. So I'd like to welcome Andrew Webber from Whitespace to the podcast today. We're going to talk about innovation ecosystems and how to collaborate with people beyond our organisation, and then probably 1,000 things beyond that. So welcome, Andrew. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Helen, and good to talk as always. So, yes, I'm the Chief Marketing and Revenue Officer at Whitespace, and what that means in plain English is that the marketing and business development functions sit within my small organisation. And Whitespace itself is an innovation engineering and consultancy firm. We work with both large and smaller private and public sector organisations. In the UK, absolutely, but also internationally. And we work typically with innovation or transformation functions within these enterprises, whether private sector or public sector. So great to be here. Thank you for the time.
And that's actually how we met in the first place, collaborating on one of those projects. So tell me, Andrew, why do you think that building an ecosystem around innovation, whether that's with tech companies or startups, is helpful to big companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually not even use the word helpful. I'd say critical and an imperative. I think there's many lessons we all have personally taken from the global crisis we all recently went through. But I think one of the things that we realized we were taking for granted, and actually was something that was challenging when you weren't sitting with people in the same space, was that ability to collaborate. And that's really what we're talking about here. When we talk about ecosystems, and I'll come back to define, well, what is an ecosystem to make sure, we're comparing apples with apples. What we're really talking about is the power of collaboration. And I've always said, the powerhouse behind any innovation is collaboration. Now, that collaboration historically in the annals of time tended to be internally. You would work within your team, you'd work across your company, you might work with a supplier or an external agency in a collaborative way to create a new capability. Let's just leave it at that in terms of innovation. That is not sustainable, particularly in the new digital age that we live in. The old ways of iterative product development or long-scale R&D product development in a digital world just are not sustainable anymore. So organizations cannot do that on their own. They just cannot move as quick as the market is moving, as quick as the technology is moving, and as quick as their customers, whoever they may be, are demanding of them. So if you can't solve the problem on your own as an organization because you simply cannot move at that speed, the way that digital allows you to do, and that leaves you open to disruption. And of course, we all have great examples of how Silicon Valley startups have taken that speed that digital allows and disrupted some extremely large organizations who couldn't move at that speed. So to solve for that, or one of the key ways to solve for that, is the power of collaboration. Not just collaborating internally anymore, but collaborating effectively with an external ecosystem, of which we'll come to later in more detail, I know, of partners that you can work with to more rapidly create capability and solve problems.
And I think there's a fear there sometimes around that collaboration externally, that perhaps we're giving something away, perhaps we're giving away access, perhaps we're giving away our brilliant idea. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't say it's a valid fear, but it's an understandable fear, particularly if you're an earlier stage startup business where the value in your business is your IP. And I know a lot of people, whenever I start engagements, both with corporates and also with startups that we sometimes work with and support, the first thing is let's put an NDA in place, because what they're really saying is we just want to put some fail-safe in just to protect the knowledge sharing and the potential sharing of IP. How enforceable an NDA is always a question I've had, even back in my days at Microsoft. I always question that. But the point is, when I was at Microsoft for some of my time there, because I was there for 10 years, I worked in the Microsoft for Startups program, as it's called now. Back then, it was called the Microsoft Ventures program. And for a period of that, I was the CEO in residence of the Accelerator program, which was based in London. It was a physical accelerator program. And we looked externally to find that at this period in time, early stage startups that were on that cusp of seed investment, obviously technology startups, because it was Microsoft. And one of the first questions that we were asked by the startups was, are you going to steal our IP, in effect? And of course, Microsoft was not looking to steal their IP at all. Far from it. They just wanted to enable and empower these early stage technology startups to scale their business quickly. Now, obviously, they'd like them to use Microsoft technology within that. Now, we've run many innovation programs for corporates since I joined Whitespace, and we still, on occasion, get asked by the startups about IP protection, and they want to put an NDA in place with the corporate before they even engage with the program. I don't think it's a valid concern anymore, candidly, because it goes to my earlier point, really. Corporates of any size, whether in public sector or private sector, they're not really there looking to hoover up people's IP. What they really want to do is solve problems. And in solving those problems, if they can accelerate the solving of those problems by collaborating with a smaller organization that has either got a capability or can stand up a capability far quicker, and then those two come together and they both benefit from the outcome commercially. It's not about IP, it's about unlocking value as quickly as possible. Now, I can't speak to the corporate venturing side. That's different, of course. When you're making corporate investments into a company, that of course you're taking a stake in their IP and a stake in the company. That's a different proposition. But when you think about open innovation, which is what we're talking about here, it has nothing to do with hoovering up IP. Candidly, maybe they do that on the venturing side, but they absolutely don't. Not in my experience. I've never known a corporate want to collaborate with startups or SMEs to secure or steal IP. It's always because they feel it's going to be the most effective way to solve a problem. So that would be my response to those concerns. But I have to say, over the years that I've run innovation programs, in the early days of running them, 4 or 5 years ago, that was quite a common question. Now, it's very rare to be asked that, because I think startups themselves and the founders of startups have increasingly recognized that actually when corporates are looking to work with them in an open innovation engagement, it is that co-creation, it is that acceleration. It's not about identifying and then stealing someone's IP.
And so where should a big corporate start in trying to build that ecosystem, that network?
It obviously depends, I guess, where their starting point is. And that will depend on the corporate themselves. It could depend on the industry they're in, because some industries, but within their DNA has always been ecosystem driven. I think, I refer to my old company, Microsoft, but other companies like them, IBM and Google and others, those born in the cloud tech companies, if you will. From day one, they knew that to be successful, they had to build an external ecosystem to give them scale, to give them repeatability, to also jointly solve for quite challenging problems from a technology perspective. Now, they've matured and they call them partner programs. They all have partner programs, and a lot of tech companies have partner programs. It's another way of describing ecosystem. It's just evolved. So those organizations are fairly advanced in terms of ecosystem, but even there, they've take again Microsoft. it looks at growing that ecosystem beyond technology partners, SMEs. It has the Microsoft for Startups program to bring those early stage companies in. It engages with universities around the world from an R&D perspective to do that sort of more longer horizon type of innovation and collaboration. But also it looks at its own suppliers and even competitors. Amazingly and increasingly, you'll see organizations that on the face of it are competitors coming together to collaborate to jointly solve problems, which they can do far quicker and far more effectively in a collaboration rather than the old style method of, we won't play nicely with our competitors. So those organizations are pretty mature. So for them to grow an ecosystem, it's sort of more of an iteration on what they've already got. Other industries that perhaps older industries, more industrial-based industries, they don't have that legacy. They don't have that ethos, culture, and model of building and working with an ecosystem of partners and suppliers and universities and startups and yada yada yada. And it's those that actually bring in organizations like Whitespace sometimes to help them understand how to do it, when to do it, and to also ensure that if you're opening your doors and bringing an ecosystem into your organization, is your organization even ready to engage with an ecosystem? You might be, as a centralized innovation function, whatever way you describe yourselves, but are your business units ready for that? Are your engineers, are your product people ready to start to take a more open approach rather than a closed approach? Big questions. Not enough time to get into the details of all the different things that you would need to think about that. But I suppose to answer your question then in short, it all depends on where you are on that journey of mindset, absolutely, because it requires a certain mindset to open up and share problems. Culture within the organization you work within to even engage with external, let's call them ecosystem partners. And also the ability to work with those partners collaboratively in a way where value is realized for all. If the value is flowing one way and only into you, that's a short-lived partnership. The value has to flow both ways, and that requires trust, transparency, and quite a rigorous approach to the operating model that you put in place to manage and grow an ecosystem.
And creating a world where everybody makes money, right?
Ultimately, absolutely. And of course, it's not always about making money, but largely it is. I completely agree. During COVID, many organizations, as we know, as they were furloughing staff and having to shut doors on their daily business, wanted to find a way to play a part, to play a role in helping, the challenges that COVID presented. Rolls Royce, not the car company, the aerospace company, was one of those organizations. It's well known that they were very quick to put their hand up around the ventilator challenge here in the UK, turning their manufacturing capabilities to build ventilators. That's well known. What maybe is not so well known is one other thing they also did in support of the UK specifically was they gave some thought to how could we take our expertise in AI and machine learning and the ability to work with data sets and drive insights from those data sets. How can we take that, collaborate with other organizations around the world to both share data sets, but also build tools and capabilities that we make available to the UK government to help them with informed decision making on COVID policy and responses. It was called the Emergent Alliance. Whitespace was one of the early organizations to join that. It had nothing to do with revenue, but what it had, and this is also important, revenue is typically the most compelling reason for organizations to collaborate. Couldn't agree more. In this instance, the compelling reason was to jointly help, to do something to help, in this instance, the UK government make decisions around how they could support the UK to recover from COVID from both an economic and a social impact. That was the compelling reason. So the Whitespace team took a leading role in building an ecosystem, we called it a consortium at the time, of over 50 companies, hundreds of individuals, and those companies were made up of startups and also very well-known global organizations. And in some instances, competitive companies, Microsoft, Google, IBM, for example, were all in this Emergent Alliance program. And it was truly quite inspiring, because what we saw in a matter of weeks is this ecosystem form. And the reason it formed so quickly is because there was a common shared purpose and goal, which wasn't revenue in this instance. But you're right, 99% of the time, it'll be revenue. But I think the key there is, what's the common shared purpose and outcome that collectively that ecosystem wants to achieve? And as you say, largely revenue.
And one of the mechanisms that we've used together, and I know you've used with others, is a startup challenge, a challenge open innovation mechanism. So what do you think makes a great challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. We call them innovation challenges, but you're right in the way you describe them. Basically, let me define what it is first, then I'll answer the question. And you know this because you and I worked on one when in your former life, obviously. It's where an organization, typically a large organization, can be private sector, can also be the public sector. We did one recently for the Ministry of Defence, for example. They have a problem set that they feel they can solve more effectively by working with an external startup or startups. That's one scenario. The other scenario is they want to actually start to build an ecosystem of external capability, which can be startups and SMEs, around certain themes. And they want to find as many relevant companies around the world around certain themes that they then can engage with them over a long period of time to address challenges within those themes. And we're about to launch an innovation challenge for Rolls Royce Defence, which is thematic based. So it's theme based rather than a specific problem that Rolls Royce Defence are trying to solve. And that's quite deliberate, because the first example, where it's a specific problem that the corporate feels there's an external capability that can solve it, that tends to be a point solution. You know, it's obviously not something they can just buy off the shelf, because otherwise they would do that rather than go into an innovation challenge process. But it is something that ultimately they want to either procure in the near term or co-create with an earlier stage startup to build a capability that they can quickly then use themselves. And that's great. But it's not an ecosystem play. That's a single engagement with a startup or startups. And that's one flavor. The second flavor, and this is the one that we're seeing increasingly, is corporates don't want to keep going from one innovation challenge to another innovation challenge to another innovation challenge, because every time it feels like they're just starting over. They actually want to start to build an ecosystem which they can continue to grow, and then they can curate and bring these innovation challenges, which is another way of describing problem sets, into their own private ecosystem. Far more effective. But of course, it goes two ways, because it also allows them to engage with that ecosystem and find the stuff they don't know, the new technology or the application of new technology that perhaps I hadn't even thought about, and other insights as well about industry trends and so on, which, if you've got a large ecosystem, is going to bring far more than what you can achieve just as an individual corporate. So when we run innovation challenges, they tend to be one or the other, but we're definitely seeing a trend that they're moving to more thematic based than point solutions. What makes a good one, therefore, a number of key things, really. First of all, why does the corporate want to run an innovation challenge? It's an important question, and it's almost the first one that I ask, because if they can't articulate why they want to do it, it's probably going to fail. Because it could be then what some people call innovation theatre. There's no outcome at the end. Okay, that's number one.
And I would say, to build on that, actually, that one of the reasons for innovation theatre is that there's a strategy gap. Someone hasn't thought about why we want to innovate, where we want to innovate, what's the sort of company we want to grow up and be in this new era.
Completely agree. Absolutely, Helen. Couldn't agree more with that. So yeah, why do you want to do it? And in fact, is it therefore the right thing? Or actually, are you even ready to do this? Because recognize that once you engage with a startup or startups, the expectations are set on both sides. The corporate has an expectation of a positive outcome for them as a corporate. The startup has obviously a different set of expectations, but ultimately, as you mentioned earlier, revenue plays a key part in that. Not always, though. It can be more about maturing the technology itself, creating a new use case for that technology, but ultimately they all point to revenue at some point. So the next question I ask the corporates is, I understand what's in it for you. That's clear, because you've articulated why you want to do it and what the problem or what you're trying to achieve. What's in it for the startups that apply? What are they going to get from this? Because all boats have to rise. What's the value exchange? I understand what they can bring you. Let's be clear about what you're going to bring to them as well. And that's a very good conversation to have early doors. Because otherwise everyone's just very disappointed further down the process, and by then it's too late. So that's the second thing. The third thing, and you know what, a lot of organizations struggle with this, and you may have found this with your experience. It's okay, so we find some very exciting capabilities from around the world, for example, startups. How do we even ingest them? How do we work with them in a meaningful time frame and at the speed that they need to work at, because they don't have the runway that we do as a large corporate? How do we onboard them? How do we get them, if required, set up as a vendor? How do we get them access to data sets, which, you know, by design are not there to be shared with just anybody, but they can't stand up a capability if they can't get to those data sets, and so on and so on. So there's some process pieces to consider. There's the whole onboarding from legal through to contracting, through to access to the IT or the data sets, that sort of stuff to plan for as well. But there's also a cultural thing to plan for. Quite often we tend to work with innovation teams. They have different names, but they're a central function in support of business units and product owners and so on. So we're working with them, and normally that's the first port of call for the startups. Once the startups have been engaged, though, by this team, they are then put into the business units or they're put into the product teams, and that innovation team moves on to their next campaign or program. And that's sort of not great sometimes for the startups, because they're now working with an internal customer that maybe has never worked with startups before, doesn't understand the challenges of working with a startup, and vice versa. And also the innovation team sometimes don't keep track of these startups. So they're just put into this monolithic enterprise organization. And then quite often that's where things fail. So there's a lot of work in, and how can you solve for that? By asking the questions up front and making sure about discussing the what next. So once you've found, or we've worked with you to find the best capability, what happens to them then? And I don't mean what happens to them, a week later. What happens to them over the next 6 to 12 months? Because you don't want, as a corporate, you don't want this to fail, because it's an expensive exercise and a time-consuming exercise. The startups definitely don't want it to fail. So we don't want anyone to be disappointed. So that it does take some reflection and some honesty by the corporate to go, are we actually able to ingest effectively these startups so we can rapidly exploit, horrible word, but exploit their capability as quickly as possible? But actually that's a good thing, because if they're exploiting it as quickly as possible, that's fantastic news for any startup, because that's exactly what they want, of course. So I've always said with innovation challenges, everyone gets excited about the end point. You've found some great companies. There's quite often a big rah-rah event, a showcase event. That's when the hard work begins. Absolutely, that's where it begins. So you have to do that classic 80-20. A lot of the thinking around the innovation challenge is up front before it's even launched. Then that's the 80%. And then the 20% is at the back end, beyond the down selection process, to ensure that value exchange is effective and everyone comes out feeling like they got the ROI that they expected.
And what's the one thing that companies can do better when they're in that process?
I think I talk to a lot of startups. Whitespace itself, with a different hat on, is in some ways a tech startup. We have technical products that we sell into corporates and public sector, so I've experienced it both ways. The biggest challenge for any startup is the speed, or sometimes the lack of speed, of organizations. And that's because of all the process and deliberate process that's been put in place within a large organization to limit risk exposure. Those very things that limit risk exposure are the very things which challenge a startup. So speed is absolutely a challenge. I don't mean the speed of people within the corporates responding. Generally, that's very good. It's when they hit their own internal systems, their own internal processes, that the speed gets horribly slow. And what's challenging about that is startups don't have a long runway. They need to be quickly realizing value from an engagement, because they're burning cash quite often. So that's something that has to be solved for, is going back to earlier comments about, are you even ready to work with startups and ingest them? And then the other one, which is like a subset of that, but always a real challenge, is the procurement process and the procurement terms. Many large corporates have quite complex procurement process, which is set up for large organizations that don't mind going through a 50-page legal document to get set up as a vendor. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two is credit terms, or payment terms. When you're working to a 60, 90, or even in some instances, and we experienced this with one large corporate, a 6-month payment term, that is absolute death nail to a startup or even a scale-up. They need 30-day terms. Even better, partial payment in advance of the capability being tested, trialed, or whatever, with a balance at the end, is even better. So that cash flow consideration is quite critical as well.
And I would say to anyone who's an innovation leader, make friends with someone in procurement.
I did that at Microsoft, yeah.
and get them to understand what you're trying to do and collaborate with them on solving for this. Because just hoping for the best and putting it through the standard process, you're going to discover all these pain points just slower.
Yeah, you're right. And Helen, couldn't agree more. And jokingly, when I was at Microsoft, one of the things I did fairly early doors was make friends, if you will, with the head of European procurement for Microsoft. And it wasn't so I could buck the system or create problems. It was more so I could understand, okay, their job is to protect the organization from risk exposure and obviously reputational damage if they bring on a wrong supplier, for example. My job, though, was I want to accelerate these smaller companies through that process. So it goes to my earlier point when we sit down with clients. It's around understanding the wider ecosystem, internal ecosystem that these startups will need to engage with to be successful, and bring them in early doors, bring the procurement, bring the legal, bring the contracting team in early doors to the whole process. And then, as you say, you're not trying to force it through after the fact. They've already been brought in and they understand. And it probably will require them to develop an exceptions pro-stage companies. And some corporates have done that very successfully.
The other thing we've touched on is public sector. So you've mentioned the MOD, you've mentioned the Emergent Alliance, and public sector is not necessarily revenue focused. So what do you think are the challenges for public sector?
I mean, you're right. Largely public sector isn't revenue focused. It's about delivering a service for this, for citizens largely. And of course, they are well funded in a way, but also they're given a huge amount that they have to do with that. So and we see that day in and day out with the NHS, for example. You're right. The driver for the public sector from that perspective isn't different, but actually the driver for solving problems expediently is absolutely preeminent in public sector, perhaps even more so than private sector at the moment, particularly. I mean, look at the public sector in the UK. We've got strikes almost every day from various aspects of the private sector. The media will, tell us it's always about pay, and I'm sure that's a part of it. But actually, if you look at it, it's more about they're just breaking at the seams because more and more is being expected of them. without the capacity to achieve that, whether that be nurses through to other public sector workers, ambulance drivers, and so on. And innovation absolutely has a role to play there. I'm not saying it's the only answer, but operational efficiencies, that's a great application of technology and innovation. But ingesting that into public sector is very challenging, and it's for one simple reason. Well, actually, there's a number of reasons, but the one primary reason that we, Whitespace, experience, as indeed many startups that are selling to public sector do, is a very worthy ambition for public sector, which has the right intent, and that's value for money. That's the phrase. So that means that whether you're a local government or indeed a Whitehall department, you have to largely go to tender for procuring capability, because you're there to drive value for money, which is almost like a race for the bottom line. It isn't necessarily the best way to drive an innovative approach. Value for money and innovation don't always go hand in hand. But what it creates is a tender process. So with a private sector organization, it's a lot easier and quicker, because if they make a decision to go with you, they put, notwithstanding our comments about procurement, it is relatively quick. But if as a startup looking to engage with, say, a 5-figure opportunity, but you have to go through a tender process, well, you're disadvantaged anyway, because some of these large organizations that sell into public sector have professional bid writers. Very, very challenging. And of course, it slows up the process even more, because you have to go into the tender process, win the contract, and then there's a cooling off period. And then you finally get to the point where with the private sector, you'd have been there months ago. So that's challenge number one. And it's frustrating for the public sector organizations. It's not like they embrace it. It frustrates them as well. So that's one challenge. But the public sector, in many ways, more than others, know they need to innovate, have to innovate, want to innovate. But because public sector exists pre-digital, and pre the technology that we now take for granted and the speed that digital moves at, their systems, their processes, and their tendering, their procurement processes I've touched on, hasn't caught up. And so their ability to find innovation is actually not as challenging as their ability to ingest that innovation, particularly with smaller organizations. And also going to my earlier point around startups who are always balancing, cash flow to runway to burn rate. When you engage with the public sector, everything that takes even longer, that makes things very, very difficult indeed. And that's why we tend to see the very large consultancies and the very large digital companies play very well in public sector. Is far more challenging for smaller companies.
And that's interesting. So if you had your magic wand, what would you wave there to increase that pipeline throughput access for startups?
If I had a magic wand, it would be, there'd be multiple spells I'd want to cast, to be honest with you. But ultimately, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the startups and the experience that they want and, the challenges they have. But actually, it is a partnership. And the magic wand I'd want is everyone gets what they want in a time frame that works for everybody. We are in an age now where technology ChatGPT is the big flavor of things at the moment, but a few years ago it was blockchain and and other technologies. We are moving at such a gallop with technology. The simple reality is that corporates, whether private sector or public sector, they fundamentally have to re-engineer their whole approach to how they work with an external partners, startups in this scenario, at speed, if they're truly going to embrace digital and the enablers that technology provides around innovative approaches to different, innovation around business models, innovation around product and platform, as well as even innovation in processes and procedures within their own organization. So the magic wand is, how can we remove what do I call them? I take an analogy with your own body, antibodies. Remove the antibodies that exist by deliberate design from years ago in the sort of industrial age, those antibodies that are there to, in some ways, limit the organization's ability to move at the speed they need to move at, to allow them to work with these external, smaller, agile type organizations at a speed that the corporate typically wants, because they want to realize the value as much as the startups. And of course, the startups absolutely need. So, and that's not just targeting procurement. I'm talking here about a whole raft of things, from operational processes to documentation to even the cultural mindset of the leaders within that organization as well. So there's many facets of that. So as I say, multiple spells without one magic wand, but ultimately to remove those antibodies, or at least always attack a startup so ferociously as they can do.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think those antibodies or those protections are there to solve a different problem. They're based on assuming that the company is doing something that's been done before, so therefore there must be a best way, so therefore all that selection process goes up front, as opposed to solving something in a new way, or thinking, how might we do something that's never been done before in this industry? And so by trying to get it all right up front to de-risk it, you're actually achieving nothing to de-risk it, because you learn by collaborating and doing and testing, and learning is the objective. Learning's not the let's avoid all learning because we know it all already.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's plenty of other magic wands I'd like to wave, but that's probably the one that I think holistically would be a sea change in this whole idea of system, which obviously we've touched on in this talk.
And thinking of your career and being at Microsoft, being at Whitespace, what's one lesson that you learned the hard way that you wish someone had tapped you on the shoulder and told you earlier?
A great question, and of course, every day is a lesson of learning for me. I never stop learning, but it narrow it down to one thing and one thing only. Look, I'll answer that in two ways, because I know a lot of this hasn't really been about Whitespace as such as a business. It's been more about our work with organizations in building open and collaborative approaches to innovation. So I'll take a Whitespace lesson, and it's this. When, as a small technology business, you are building a new capability to address a market opportunity that you believe exists, apart from the obvious, validate that market opportunity actually exists, clearly. One of the key things that I've identified is you need product management there day one. You need someone that understands what it is to build a product, not build an engineering solution, not build a one-off bespoke solution for a corporate or a large entity, because that's not a product, that's a one-off solution. It's actually, how can you take that background IP, that core capability, and actually repeatedly sell it to a range of different customers. And for that, you need product management, product capability up front in the team. And from a Whitespace perspective, we have built products. We've driven them by engineering largely, with market research informing for sure. But what we learned fairly quickly is we need that product expertise in there day one. And again, if I could have my time back over, that's what we would have done. And it would have saved us many months downstream of having to recover that position. So that's been a key learning from a tech startup perspective in terms of product, developing your product. That critical role of product management. The key learning that I've had personally, not as a Whitespace thing, which, if I could do my time back over, is, and I learned this in Microsoft, one of the best companies I've ever worked for, notwithstanding Whitespace. I was 10 years at Microsoft and I loved it, is the power of different thinking, diversity of thinking. And Satya Nadella, the current, obviously, CEO of Whitespace, I'll paraphrase him. He didn't quite put it in these terms, but this is largely what he described is the lesson I learned when I joined Microsoft. He didn't want 10 Microsofties going into a room and coming out with one idea, groupthink. He wanted 10 different ideas coming out of that room. Even if some of them were just complete harebrained ideas, it was that diversity and difference of thinking. That thinking evolved to something called growth mindset or growth hacking, which is embedded now in the core of the Microsoft culture. Real learning for me, because I joined Microsoft out of more, let's call them traditional industry-based businesses, where groupthink was a good thing. If you all came out of that room all on the same page, all with the same idea, that was a good outcome. Especially if it didn't involve working with anyone outside of the organization, that was even better. And so going in with that approach and initially sitting down in a room with Microsoft folk, and there's this open discussion around different ideas and different approaches to things, and some were reverse engineering the problem because that's how they worked. Others were taking it more creatively because that's how they worked. Others were all about, well, what does the customer think, because that's what. But having all of that sort of melting pot of diversity in a room was hugely powerful. And that was a real learning for me, and I definitely learned the power of diversity of thinking, let's call it that, at Microsoft, and how that unlocks true innovation, because you don't have one single view on a problem and how to solve it. You have this diverse range of views. So that's a more personal, if I can have my time back over, I'd have learned that and done that in other roles. And then from a Whitespace perspective, as I think of it as a technology requirement to have a product expertise day one.
Fantastic. There's lots of food for thought there.
Hopefully.
And if people want to get in touch with Whitespace or you, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, best way to do it is by all means send me an email, which is andrew@white.space, easy, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I love connecting and sharing and listening and learning. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of learning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciate it. What a great chat.
Absolute pleasure, Helen. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thanks for listening to The Innovation Crowd. Subscribe on your favourite podcasting service so you don't miss a thing. And I'll see you next time.